How's everyone this afternoon? This gloomy day. Any questions before I begin? Okay. So if I recall correctly, go over the research note again. Okay, that's a good question. What I'm asking you to do on the, well, it depends. If you, I don't know how many sources you are looking at. If you're looking at one, then that's what you're looking at. If you're looking at many, then that would be many. That is, each one of you is doing something slightly different. So I'm sorry to make it even more confusing and complicated than it needs to be. And essentially what you're doing is explaining what you found in this, what's of interest to you, what you might need to look at further. That is what your sources are. This is probably something you have done in your head when you've been doing an assignment like this, just figuring out where you are, what you've figured out so far, what your source is, what it tells you, who wrote it, when was it published, and then what are the questions it raises. So that's really what you're doing. It's a speculative thing as opposed to a final, you've now figured this out and can explain it all. That is, what questions do you have about this? What don't you understand about this? As well as what questions you hope this can answer. So it is really an opportunity for you at this point in the process to sit down and just think about where you are and where you're going. Okay, it's not a rough draft of your final paper. It's not an outline of your final paper. It's really a note about what you have found so far. And this will help me to figure out, if I have anything I can suggest to you, any areas you might want to look into, or if you're on the wrong track or if you're on the right track. So it's an opportunity for you just to stop and think about where you are, at this moment in the process, because writing anything is a process. And, you've gotten a source, you've kind of figured out a general topic, and now you're in the process of figuring out where you go with it. So that's it. I'm sorry it's vaguer than it should be. I wish I could say, yeah, you'll do 5 paragraphs and each one will have so many words. No, that's no problem asking so many questions. The objective of the assignment is to figure out where you are in the process of the final assignment. Okay. I don't know if that helps or not. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, so for what we submit to you, what format are you looking for? Do you want us to just copy the questions you sent in the email and then just go down and answer them? Or do you want a specific format?
You could do that. Some of you I know are more thorough and would want to put it in an essay form. I don't simply want bullet points. I want something that shows you've actually thought about it more. Some of you, you already sent me what the source is you're using. That's good. This is a little more elaborated than that. That is what you're getting out of this, what you've learned so far. What's the objective of the primary source exploration? Okay, well, that is actually to get you used to using a primary source, to give you the experience of delving into something that hasn't been gone over by 1,000 historians before. Some of it has been. But looking at this time or these ideas for yourself, stripping away whatever kind of scholarly apparatus has been built up over the years, and just looking at the sources themselves and figuring out what they say. Okay, so that's the overall objective of the primary source thing. I don't know if that helps Skylar or anyone else. And by the way, Skylar's brave enough to ask questions. Usually I find if one person is asking, it means everyone else is wondering, but doesn't have the courage to ask for fear of being thought. Yes, Brittany.
So, I don't know if you got a chance to look at my
source. Yeah. That was kind of what I was looking for.
Right. So if I were to kind of add on a little bit more to that, would that be like an example?
That would be it. That would be, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. It's any other questions? Yes, Skylar.
So the end product that we come up with, the final paper, how long is that going to be? And is it just an extended version of our note that we're writing right now? I don't know why I'm so confused.
Yeah,
The
okay.
syllabus was a little unclear to me. So
No, no, okay, that's okay. I'm sorry it's unclear to you. It should be, say, in the 5 to 7 page range, the final product. And, you know, the note may be something simpler. So yeah, okay, good. That answered your question. Any other questions on this? I am looking forward to seeing what you found. Yes, Haley.
I was just wondering if you will be like providing comments on what we submit.
Yes, that's the purpose of it. For me to
Okay,
provide
awesome.
comments. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
So, okay, good. So, where did we leave off last time? I know it's been a while. You all have eventful lives. Lots has happened since then. And yes, Paul.
We just finished talking about how Franklin wanted to bring clergymen into the debate hall to
Okay.
ask God for help.
Okay. And how'd that go?
Not well.
Okay. So the convention doesn't have money to engage ministers, also worried that what it'll look like. More importantly, it does get the delegates to think for a minute about what they're doing more seriously. They've been arguing with each other for about 6 weeks, hadn't really gotten anywhere. And this is Franklin reminding them of the importance of what they're doing. And after this, actually on the 29th of June, that is the next day. Paul, do you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I just had a question. So I was under the interpretation that Franklin was a Christian deist. So I was wondering why he would appeal to bring in ministers and why he would want to ask God for advice if he believed that God wouldn't intervene and help them.
That's a very good observation, because Franklin, and in the speech he says, I've come to the conclusion that God governs in the affairs of men. And this is the same Franklin who, was a friend of Voltaire and of David Hume, the two great 18th century skeptics. And here he is calling for prayer. It's an interesting moment in the convention, and it would be worth discussing at greater length. I mean, it is one of the things about Franklin, it always keeps us wondering. And he usually has a deeper purpose than anyone else can fathom. So yeah, it's a very good question. And it's at the same time, by the way, it's 1789, 1790, when Franklin is clearly nearing the end of his life. Ezra Stiles, who is the president of Yale, as well as a New England clergyman, writes to Franklin wanting to know if Franklin has accepted God. And Franklin is reluctant to say. And he says, yes, he's read a lot of the theological arguments about the existence of God, non-existence of God. He said, I am soon enough going to have an opportunity of finding out, so I don't see any real point now in belaboring the point. Franklin's sister, who lives in Boston, and over the long course of Franklin's life is the person he corresponds with most, is really quite shocked at different points when she hears that her brother might be an atheist or might be questioning divinity. And he writes kind of reassuring letters to her, but never entirely saying. That is, Franklin, like David Hume, is a skeptic. And Voltaire, I think you could say, is an atheist, and a lot of the French are. But Franklin and Hume are skeptics and are susceptible to proof, looking for things that are susceptible to proof. And in the case of Franklin here, he says that in the contest with England in this room, we did have daily prayers, and those prayers were answered. So that's again, this is one of my favorite subjects, and I apologize since it may not be yours, except for Paul. And I don't want this to turn into a dialogue about Franklin and God, and two very interesting phenomena, by the way, Franklin and God. And that would be a good subject for a course. But anyway, yeah, very good question. I like to bring it up just because we know about Franklin, the great skeptic, and here he is calling for divine aid. And the convention, though, balks at that. But what does happen in the wake of this? The next day, in fact, one of the delegates from Connecticut, William Samuel Johnson, proposes a compromise. How about having one of the houses in the national legislature be apportioned according to population, and in the other one, the states will have an equal vote? The ultra-nationalists, that is Madison, Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, Alexander Hamilton, the ones who want to create a national government as opposed to a federal government, don't like this plan at all. And the delegates from the smaller states ask Washington, who is the president of the convention, to write to the governor of New Hampshire saying, send your delegates. New Hampshire hasn't sent its delegates yet. And New York and New Jersey vote yes. Let's have Washington write to the governor of New Hampshire. The other states vote no. That is Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. They vote against writing to the governor of New Hampshire. They don't want any more of these small states guys here. And Maryland was divided. So, and their justification isn't, hey, we don't want to have any of the small state people here, but they say that would violate the secrecy we've been operating under. If now Washington is writing to the governor of one state, why doesn't he write to governors of other states? Say, hey, send more of your delegates. So it's that is stopped. And on the 2nd of July, the convention does appoint a committee to work out some kind of a compromise on representation. And when the convention appoints a committee, there will be one member from each state. And this particular committee purposefully excludes any of the ultra-nationalists. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts is appointed to chair the committee, and the others on it, Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut, Abraham Yates from New York, William Patterson, remember he's the guy who proposed the New Jersey plan, Franklin, Gunning Bedford from Delaware, Luther Martin, who's the big proponent of let's protect the interests of the smaller states. Remember, Martin had given this 2-day speech about worrying about the big states trampling on the smaller ones, George Mason and Rutledge from South Carolina and a couple of others. So this committee then gets to work over July 4th. And remember, the convention did have a sermon preached on July 4th in commemoration of independence. And the next day, it brings in its proposal. And Franklin makes the motion to introduce this proposal that in the lower house of the national legislature, each state will have a representative for every 40,000 people. States with fewer than 40,000 people would still have one vote. And this house would be the only one that could originate money bills or tax bills. The thinking is, this is the one that represents the people who are going to be taxed. So this will be where money bills will start. In the other house, each state will have an equal vote. It doesn't say initially whether it'll be one representative or two, but each state will have an equal vote. So this is a compromise. Remember the thing they'd been arguing about for 6 weeks was big states versus small states. And with this compromise, they're able to work that out. It seems relatively simple to us, although now, of course, you hear people from, who don't like this federal piece of it, wanting to have, why does Wyoming have as many senators as California? Well, it's because Delaware didn't want to be overwhelmed by Virginia, and because the states do have a role in a federal system. So it's this essential compromise that it's the heart of it. But then so it resolves one of the huge issues of the convention. The convention seemed to be about to break up over this very issue. Will each state be represented according to population or according to it being a state? By the way, one of the things that happened, we see in one of the delegates who kept a note of what was happening at the convention, when there's this big debate going on, the guys from the small states and the guys from the big states are all meeting together. In fact, sometimes they're staying at the same boarding houses. That's just how they broke up in Philadelphia. And they, guys from the big states, that is some of the Virginians, some of the Pennsylvanians, some of the Massachusetts guys, had arrived at the convention early and they're all standing in the front of the room arguing with each other about something. Really contentious. And if you think about it, you know that, yeah, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts are all big states, but they all have pretty significant differences among them. And these guys don't agree on everything. The guys from Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey come in and they see these big state proponents there arguing with each other, and they realize that the mere fact that you come from a big state doesn't necessarily mean you agree with everyone else who comes from a big state. So, Texas and California have significant differences today. Florida, Texas, California, New York among the bigger states, but that doesn't mean they agree on things. So, having resolved that issue, though, it raises another one, which is who are the 40,000 people in each state who are entitled to a representative? And remember, it says 40,000 people. It doesn't say 40,000 men or 40,000 free men or white men. It says 40,000 people. So this raises a big question about whether states that have an enslaved population will be entitled to representation for the enslaved population. And of course, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia very much want to have the enslaved population represented and having an additional seat or more seats in Congress. On the other hand, states which have a smaller or no enslaved population think this is going to give them too much weight in the federal councils. And this debate goes on for about a week. And ultimately, the convention resolves it with what's called the 3/5 compromise, that every 5 enslaved people, or they don't use the word slave in the Constitution, every 5 of the other people will count as 3 free people. So this is, by the way, the same ratio that had been deduced back in 1783 in the Congress for taxation. That is, states have requisitions imposed on them based on their population, and so they counted an enslaved population in the ratio of 3/5. So it's the same ratio. The recognition also is the states are going to be taxed according to their property. And so in some respects, enslaved people are counted as people, and in some cases, they're counted as property. If you're interested in this debate, you can find it in the records of the convention, Max Barron's Volume 1, pages 578 to 88. And then in Madison, in Federalist number 54, addresses it again. It is one of the significant compromises being worked out at the convention. And at the same time this is happening in New York, the Confederation Congress is meeting. The old Continental Congress is still in business. They're meeting in New York. And in the summer of 1787, it passes the Northwest Ordinance, that is establishing a government in the territory north and west of the Ohio River. And this actually bans slavery north of the Ohio River after 1800. So this is the one remaining territory that is controlled by the United States, as opposed to, Georgia controls everything or claims everything to the Mississippi River, westward, and North Carolina and Virginia. Similarly, this territory had been ceded to the United States by Virginia and other states that had a claim to it. And in the summer of 1788, Congress votes to prohibit slavery north of it after 1800. And there is some thought that this will prevent the institution of slavery from spreading. I mean, it's an interesting question about how this group is grappling with the question of slavery in 1787. So by the end of July, the convention has come up with, they have a committee of detail. They appoint a committee of detail to draw up a memorandum laying out what they have covered so far, or what they have decided so far. You can think of this as like your research note. They've been at this now for 2 months, and now they're saying, okay, this is what we have decided. They actually print up the committee of detail report so everyone knows what it is they have decided. And what they have decided so far is that the government they create will have there will be a two-house legislature. One house will represent population, every 40,000 people, and they will determine the population by having a census every 10 years. This is the reason we have a census, to determine how many seats in Congress each state should have. And this house will be chosen every 2 years by voters in the state who have the same qualifications to vote for members of the lower house of the state legislature. This is another huge problem. States have different qualifications for voting. So how do you determine who votes in the federal legislature? Well, they say if you can vote for the lower house of your state legislature, you can vote for this one. The upper house, which we'll call the Senate, is going to have 2 members from each state. The senators will be chosen for a 6-year term, and they will be chosen by the state legislature. This is a way of giving the states a role in the functioning of the federal government. So the lower house represents population. The upper house represents the states as political entities. And then this draft spells out what the powers of this government will be. And if you turn to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that is pretty much the list they have. That is, these are the powers of the Congress. And this is going to be a subject of discussion. And so it's a carefully enumerated list of powers the government will have. And next, they had also decided at this point that there would be an executive. And they decided it would be one person, and this person would be chosen by the national legislature and would serve a 7-year term, would not be eligible for re-election. He would be able to veto laws that the Congress passed, but the Congress could override his veto with a 2/3 vote. And also there would be a national judiciary. There's not a whole lot of detail on what the national judiciary would do, who would be on it, how it would be appointed, et cetera. They just say there will be a national judiciary. So again, we're using the word national, although we also have these federal features to it. Any comments on this? Any questions so far? So I'm elaborating on this whole plan as it's emerging from the convention. Yes, Mitchell.
Yeah, so you're talking about how the nationalists didn't agree a lot with this plan. What exactly did they have in mind?
Well, at this point, some of them are agreeing with it, okay? They would have wanted both houses of the national legislature to represent population. So Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania would have more representatives than Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, Connecticut, because they're bigger states. They didn't like having an equal vote in the legislature because they remembered that under the Confederation, one state had been able to block what the other states wanted. You know, Delaware or New York or Rhode Island could squelch things. And so they wanted a national government. Remember, Hamilton wanted to abolish the states entirely. I don't know that any of the others would have gone along with that idea, you know, but they wanted a national government as opposed to a federal government. Patterson, Mace, Martin want a federal government that rests on the states. And there are reasons for this. It's going to come up, by the way, in the debate over ratification. It's one of the reasons people like Samuel Adams and Richard Henry Lee are going to oppose the Constitution, because it does create a national government, and they think that there won't be any check on what this government can do. It's a good question. And I think another thing we're seeing is, you know, during this debate, I think it was John Dickinson had pointed it. He said in one of the debates, you see what happens when you push things too far. We came here knowing we needed to change the Articles of Confederation, but the American people are not going to accept a national government. And the whole thing is going to fail because you're not going to compromise on this, not going to allow the states their existence as entities. So that's just a problem. By the way, it's a problem they don't entirely resolve in 1787. It's the same issue that's going to come up at the time of the Civil War and periodically surfaces since. So the Civil War pretty much solves the issue of who has sovereignty in the system. Is it the United States or the people of the United States or the people in the states? Anyway, there is a list of things states cannot do. And this is something, of course, the nationalists would have liked. States cannot coin money. States can't raise a military force. And states can't make anything but gold or silver legal tender to pay debts. And then another very important feature is that the Constitution will be ratified by conventions in each state. Now, the Congress doesn't have a role in this. The state legislatures don't have a role in this. It has to be a convention chosen in each state specifically for this purpose. And so you're bypassing the legislatures. The legislatures will see their powers are really going to be constrained in this. Another thing Madison really wanted was to give the national government the veto power over laws the states passed. That's out of it now. It would have been Madison's one way of preserving the balance in the system is giving the federal government or national government a veto power over state laws. That's not going to happen. We'll see later on, those of us who take the time to read what Madison has to say in explaining why the Constitution is a good thing. He still sees a check there. Oliver Ellsworth, who is one of the delegates from Connecticut, says that the system, as we're reading the Committee of Detail report, he says it is partly national, partly federal. That is, it rests both on the states. The Senate has an equal vote for each state. And it also rests on the people of the United States. That is, the lower house does represent population as instead of the states. But some parts of it in the Committee of Detail report, and one reason they're putting it here is just to figure out what they have decided, what blanks need to be filled in. And two of the big blanks here are how to choose the president. And that's a complicated thing. And also a question of, the question comes back of who should vote. And this is on the 7th of August. Let me just see. I'm going to see if I can share my screen and we'll try to take a look at this. Maybe not. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Okay, so this is the 7th of August, and Gouverneur Morris wants to amend the portion of the report that says the people who can vote for members of the House, lower house, will have the same qualifications as those who vote for the lower house of the state legislature. He wants to amend this and say freeholders can vote for members of Congress. That is, instead of, you've paid a shilling in taxes in Pennsylvania, that entitles you to vote for the members of the legislature. If you also happen to be a guy over 21. You have to own a freehold, that is property that isn't mortgaged. You own it. Why do you suppose he wants to do this? Well, he's going to explain why he wants to do this. Saying, let's restrict the vote to freeholders. And here you can see Morris saying, such a hardship would be neither great nor novel. The people are accustomed to it, not dissatisfied with it, so in several of the states. In some, the qualifications are different for the choice of governor and representatives, and others for different houses of the legislature. Another objection against the clause is it makes qualifications for the national legislature depend on the will of the states. Okay, so you have to have a freehold, that is a significant amount of property or enough property to qualify for a vote in the federal legislature. Any thoughts on this? Yes, Jovan.
I would think a good reason to make it so that if you're going to be in the national legislature, you need property is because a person with independent property is independent, really. If you
Yeah.
have a mortgage, you're kind of subject to a bank. If you
Sure.
own property, you're subject to someone else's land. So if you're going to have people who are going to be making decisions that are best for the nation, they have to be able to act as independent people. They can't be beholden to others besides their constituency. If they're
Okay. Yeah, but this isn't a good point. That's what he would say. But this isn't for people who are going to be in the national legislature. This is for people who are going to vote for members of the national legislature. So in order to vote for the federal House of Representatives, you would need to own a freehold property in whatever state you're voting in.
Oh, well, even in that case, I think the situation is pretty similar. If someone's going to exercise political action or political thought, they have to be a person who's competent to do so. And an aspect of competence is independence.
Right.
If you're beholden to others, you shouldn't.
That's a very, very good point. And then you can see Oliver Ellsworth objects to Morris's idea. And he says the right of suffrage is a tender point, strongly guarded by most of the state constitutions. Excuse me. The people will not readily subscribe to the national constitution if it should subject them to be disenfranchised. The states are the best judges of the circumstances and temper of their own people. And so you have Ellsworth saying, don't think this is a good idea because people are sensitive about voting. You know, Jovan and Gouverneur Morris have made a very good argument for why you should restrict this to property holders instead of just letting anyone vote. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this? It does become a contentious issue. Or should we just leave it to Jovan and Gouverneur Morris to carry on? Yes, V.
Well, the way that's being described is that if they only allow people that had land to vote, then the voting then would be just restricted just for those of wealth or had property. And instead of allowing the portion of all the people in the colonies or counties to be able to vote, you're in a way now you're self-discriminating.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get to this, back to this, but you're right. Yes, Haley.
I was basically just going to say the same thing and just going to limit the power to the wealthy and those who have land.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a thing to remember as we're talking about this, everyone in this particular assembly is going to be able to vote. They're all freeholders. None of them is going to lose his vote because of this. So they're really thinking about, they're thinking about the rest of us outside. And then you see Ellsworth saying this would be a bad idea. And then Pierce Butler, who is from Georgia, also says there's no right in which the people are more jealous than that of suffrage. Abridgments of it tend to the same revolution as in Holland, where they've thrown all the power into the hands of the Senate, who fill up vacancies themselves and form a rank aristocracy. They can see the danger of this. And then John Dickinson, remember, he was the guy who wrote the Farmers' Letters. He had a different idea of the tendency of vesting the right of suffrage in the freeholders. He considered them the best guardians of liberty, kind of what Jovan was saying. They have property, they can be independent. The restriction of the right to them as a necessary defense against the dangerous influence of those multitudes without property and without principle, with which our country will in time abound. And as to the unpopularity of this innovation, he thought it was chimerical, that is, something that would fade. The great mass of our citizens are freeholders, and they'll be pleased with it. So right now, most people are freeholders. They're not going to object. But you have to think about, in time, we're going to have these masses of people who don't have property, and do you really want them to be controlling things? Ellsworth has kind of a technical point here about how will you define a freehold? And then he says, ought not every man who pays a tax to vote for the representative who is to levy and dispose of his money? Shall the wealthy merchants and manufacturers who will bear a full share of the public burdens not be allowed in the imposition of them? So he's thinking, you're a wealthy merchant, and Ellsworth represents Connecticut, so he's probably thinking of people in New London or New Haven who have shipping interests. They don't own land, but this means they won't be able to vote. Okay. By the way, does anyone want to read Gouverneur Morris's really interesting speech here? Or do you want me to read it? Okay. Morris had long learned not to be the dupe of words. The sound of aristocracy, therefore, had no effect on him. They're saying, okay, you limit the vote to freeholders, you're going to create an aristocracy. It was the thing and not the name to which he was opposed. And one of his principal objections to the Constitution as it is now before us is that it threatens this country with an aristocracy. The aristocracy will grow out of the House of Representatives. Give the votes to people who have no property, and they will sell them to the rich who will be able to buy them. We should not confine our attention to the present moment. The time is not distant when this country will abound with mechanics and manufacturers who will receive their bread from their employers. Will such men be the secure and faithful guardians of liberty? Will they be the impregnable barrier against aristocracy? He was as little duped by the association of the words taxation and representation. By the way, what do you make of this so far? The aristocracy is going to come from the House of Representatives because there will be people who will essentially be there because they've bought votes from the people who work for someone else. By the way, at this time, most voting was done publicly. You stood up in a town meeting, so everyone knows how you voted. So if you work for someone else and you vote the way they don't like, you're going to lose your job, which is why Jovan was saying you wanted people who are independent, and why Gouverneur Morris is saying you want people who are independent. Otherwise, you'll have these people selling their votes. The man who does not give his vote freely is not represented. It is the man who dictates the vote. Children don't vote. Why? Because they want prudence, because they have no will of their own. The ignorant and the dependent can be as little trusted with the public interest. He did not conceive the difficulty of defining freeholders to be insuperable, still less that the restriction could be unpopular. 9/10 of the people at present are freeholders, and these will certainly be pleased with it. As to merchants, etc., if they have the wealth and value the right, they can acquire it. If not, they don't deserve it, right? Okay, Ellsworth had been saying, what about a rich merchant? And Morris is saying, well, a rich merchant, if he wants to vote, can buy property. I mean, that's how you get this access. I'm starting to talk myself into liking this proposal more. I don't know if anyone else is on Jovan's and mine's side now with Gouverneur Morris saying, yeah, we don't want the elections to be dominated by people without property and without principles who will sell their votes. To getting stuff from the House of Representatives. Yes, Paul.
I mean, I feel like you could argue the same thing on the other side and just say, well, people who want other citizens to vote for their thing, they could just give them land, give them property and say, you're going to vote this way then in exchange for this land.
Conceivably they could, but more likely if, you're working for me, and I pay you, that's, I don't know. I guess you could say that. I guess what you seem to be saying is there's a tendency to corruption in anything. Jovan, you have a thought on this?
Yeah, in regards to Paul's point, I don't think what Governor Morris is saying fully outlaws corruption or prevents it.
Yeah.
But it's a lot harder to say, okay, well, I'm just going to buy up tons of land and just parcel it out to people than to say, okay, I run a business, you work for me. If you don't do this, I'll just fire you.
Right. Yeah.
It's not making it impossible, but it just makes it more difficult.
Yeah, I think you might be right. And then you can see if there is open land, again, I guess that tendency is there. Okay, now look at what George Mason says. Mason, by the way, probably owns as much land as anyone else here in this gathering. And And he says, we feel too strongly the remains of ancient prejudices, view things too much through a British medium. By the way, we could have played a game before and speculated how you think these people are going to vote on this matter of restricting the right to vote to freeholders. Because remember, they're all freeholders. They're not going to lose their vote, whatever happens. The true idea, in his opinion, was that every man having evidence of attachment to and permanent common interest with a society ought to share its rights and privileges. Think of that. If you have a permanent attachment to and a common interest with a society, you ought to share its rights and privileges. Was this qualification restricted to freeholders? Does no other kind of property but land evidence a common interest in the proprietor? Does nothing besides property mark a permanent attachment? Ought the merchant, the moneyed man, and I think you can see merchants and moneyed men being represented in the system, but then look at the next category. The parent of a number of children whose fortunes are to be pursued in their own country. Are they to be viewed as suspicious characters? So Mason sees other evidence of a permanent common interest in society than having money or having property. You have a lot of children who are going to live in this society that you should be able to vote and not be viewed as a suspicious character unworthy to be trusted with the common rights of your fellow citizens. Madison says this is a fundamental article of Republican government, ought not to be left to be regulated by the legislature. Then talks about how gradually abridging the right has been the mode in which aristocracies have been built on the ruins of popular forms. Then he says, not sure. Should it be a freehold? And to him, it would depend on the probable reception such a change would meet with in the states where the right was now exercised by all descriptions of people. Madison is really a politician here. How will people in states where non-freeholders vote take this if the Constitution restricts it? He seems to be open to argument on either side. And I think probably the most important of the speeches here is by Franklin. And this is the one time Franklin speaks extemporaneously. Typically, when Franklin has something to say, he writes it out and has it read. This time he gets up and says, it is of great consequence that we should not depress the virtue and public spirit of our common people, of which they displayed a great deal during the war. And he talks about the American prisoners of war, American sailors carried into British prisons during the war, and they refused to enter onto British ships, where British sailors would serve on the American fleet. And this proceeds from the different manner in which the common people are treated in America and Great Britain. He did not think that the elected had any right in any case to narrow the privileges of the electors. And he quoted an arbitrary British statute that said tumultuous meetings are dangerous, and so narrowed the right of suffrage. And then this was soon followed by the succeeding parliament saying the people who had no votes had to perform peculiar labors and hardships. So, and Franklin is against restricting the right to vote to freeholders. Mercer of Maryland and Rutledge of South Carolina also are against it. And so the question actually fails. So interesting discussion here about aristocracy, who should vote. And at the end of the day, it is decided that if you can vote for the lower house of your state legislature, then you can vote for members of Congress. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, so the next thing they have to figure out is how to choose the president. No one was really happy with having the national legislature choose, since that would mean the executive would be under the control of the national legislature. And remember, they have this idea that the different branches should be separate and somewhat independent of each other. But no one really could think of a better way to do this other than having the national legislature do it. And they also realize that the smaller states wouldn't want to have a population alone determining who was elected president. Because, think about Delaware. Maybe there's a good reason Delaware never had a president until fairly recently, but they're really worried about Delaware, or Maryland or these other small states not being able to get their candidate elected nationally. And so they create this system where the legislature doesn't have the first role in this. And by the way, the way the electoral system works now is not quite the way they imagined it would work. In fact, it only works the way they imagined it would once, and that was in 1824. They imagined that what would happen is the electors, and these electors chosen in each state in whatever way the state wants to choose them, and each state will have the same number of electors as they have members of Congress plus the Senate. They'll meet on the same day in every state capital and vote, and each one will vote for two people. By the way, the electors can't hold any other office. So this is their job. The thinking is these will be disinterested people, and they have to vote for two people so that one of them has to be from a state other than their own. The thinking is everyone in Georgia is going to vote for the guy from Georgia. Everyone in Massachusetts is going to vote for the guy from Massachusetts, but they also have to vote for someone else. And so from among those votes for someone else, you're going to get 4, 5 candidates who have some significant support from beyond the boundaries of their state. And they're meeting, by the way, the electors are meeting in each state capital so that agents from Britain and France don't show up trying to bribe them. I mean, it would be much more difficult to go to 13 different state capitals and try to find these guys and bribe them. So they're all casting their votes. Then their votes are sent to the Congress, and both houses of Congress have to assemble to count the votes. The anticipation was no one is going to have a majority of these votes. So from the top vote getters, the top 4 or 5 vote getters, the Congress would choose a president. And when the Congress does that, is the House of Representatives, the body that represents, the people, chooses the president, but each state has one vote. They're thinking this is the way the system is going to work. They kind of suspected Washington probably would be elected, but then after Washington, who and how? So the thinking is everyone has to vote for 2 people, one from a state other than their own. And then from that list, the Congress chooses. And because there may be someone who gets a significant amount of votes but doesn't come in first, and everyone has to vote for 2 people, what do you do with the second person? Well, you create the office of vice president. They hadn't thought of a vice president before. The only reason they have one is because they need to make this electoral college work. So they thought that you'd have candidates from different parts of the country, and then the Congress would choose. The vice president's job is to preside over the Senate. And this system does give the states a role in choosing the president. That is, the electors are chosen by each state, and the states choose them in different ways. In the first election, many of the states have the legislature choose the electors. In others, their electors are elected by a popular vote. That is, you vote for someone to be an elector. And it doesn't really work the way the framers anticipated, except in 1824, when there are 4 different candidates, each representing a different region of the country. And other than that, one candidate has received a majority of the electoral vote. Matt, do you have your question, or is that just something in your background that I'm seeing up in the corner of your screen over your other shoulder?
I think it's just the sign on the wall.
Okay, good. So they create this system. Actually, it's the work of mainly of Gouverneur Morris he's representing Pennsylvania, but he's from New York. And New York has a similar system for choosing the governor. That is, each county has a certain number of votes that they can cast for governor in New York, depending on the population of the county. So that's the system. And some other day I can explain. Well, I'm a great proponent of the Electoral College and keeping it. So if you wanted to argue about that, we can do it at some other point. Okay, now this resolves another of the big problems, but then another one comes up. The convention did have a committee on postponed parts to come up with things they decided, hey, we'll discuss later on. So now we're nearing the end of August. And remember, this group had assembled in May. So they've been meeting through the summer, and it's been quite contentious at times, and people have come and gone. And during the debate on one of the Congress's power to pass navigation acts, that is, laws about trade, and states are not allowed to tax exports. And can states tax imports? They decide no, that is navigation acts, and Congress's power to levy taxes on imports comes up. And George Mason of Virginia wants to require a 2/3 vote of Congress to pass any tariff law, taxes on imports or exports. He doesn't want a simple majority. That is, he recognizes that there are going to be more people in what he calls the trading states, New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, than in the states like Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. And he wants to give these states some control and not have simple majorities pass tariff laws, because he knows that if they pass a law restricting trade or putting a tariff on goods being imported, that means England and France, which are markets for Virginia tobacco, will put tariffs on tobacco. So he wants to protect Virginia's tobacco markets by limiting how tariffs can be imposed on imported goods. At the same time, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, which have large merchant communities, want to have simple majorities passing tariff laws because they benefit from having protection for trade. Now, at the same time, Mason is making this proposal. Luther Martin from Maryland, also a tobacco planter and also, like Mason, a slave owner, introduces a clause which will abolish the slave trade by 1800. Remember, the Congress in New York had abolished slavery in the Northwest Territory after the year 1800, and now Mason proposes ending the slave trade itself by the year 1800. And Mason goes along with this, and Mason gives a speech attacking the brutality of the slave trade. At this time, there is a big international movement going on to end the slave trade and the well-documented horrors of the slave trade. However, the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina are still importing large numbers of people from Africa to work in the rice plantations. And they see that ending the slave trade will hurt their economies, and they can't support a limit on it. Also, they say the Virginians and Marylanders are really hypocritical. The reason they want to restrict the international slave trade is because Virginia and Maryland have too many enslaved people, and they want to sell them in South Carolina and Georgia, which will be easier if South Carolina and Georgia are not importing slaves from Africa. So they, Georgia and South Carolina delegates say, we can't go along with this. And even if we could, the people in our states wouldn't vote for a constitution which doesn't allow us to import people from Africa. So you have two contentious issues. Mason and Martin wanting to require a 2/3 vote to pass navigation acts. And that's something Georgia and South Carolina would have supported that idea. And then Mason and Martin also wanting to end the slave trade by 1800. And that's something Georgia and South Carolina won't go along with. And these two different issues are referred to another committee. And on this committee, the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina strike a bargain with the delegates from Connecticut and Massachusetts. We will accept a simple majority passing navigation acts if you go along with us and allow the slave trade to continue for 20 years instead of ending it in 1800. And so this compromise is then reported to the convention, which accepts it. But Mason is outraged with this compromise because you're compromising on the issue of slavery, also not requiring a 2/3 vote for navigation acts. And Mason says very dramatically, I will sooner cut off my right hand than use it to sign this Constitution. Now, as this is happening, it's clear the convention now is just about finished what it was doing. Mason and Elbridge Gerry then propose adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And now it's the first week of September. The delegates have been at this for, I don't know, 2.5 months. And they don't want to take up a Bill of Rights, 3.5 months. And some of the delegates already had left. And among those who had left are guys who are going to go home and oppose ratifying the Constitution. And the whole proposal of having a Bill of Rights added is voted down. And then the Committee of Style takes the 23 articles that the Committee of Detail had issued and whittles them down to 7 articles. Gouverneur Morris does the real work of drawing up the Constitution in its final form, which on the 17th of September, the delegates then prepare to vote on. Okay, any questions so far? I know I'm giving this as a simple monologue rather than letting you weigh in on this, which shouldn't color the way you think of the Constitution, that it's someone droning on to you about what it is rather than you taking charge of it, being empowered to understand it. Paul is holding his head and leaning against the wall. He is so worn out with this whole process. He looks like someone who's been debating this for 3 months in a hot summer in Philadelphia with the windows closed because they don't want anyone knowing what's happening inside the room. Okay, well then, I will go on then. George Mason announces he won't support the Constitution. No Bill of Rights, bargain over slavery and navigation acts. And he says we should have a second convention. They can go over the same ground and come up with a better plan. We'll have a simple majority, doesn't like a simple majority making navigation acts, doesn't like the lack of a Bill of Rights. And he thinks that what will happen is the value of tobacco, rice, and other commodities will go down, slave trade will continue, and the government, he says, will commence in a moderate aristocracy. At present, it's impossible to foresee whether it will produce a monarchy or a corrupt, oppressive aristocracy. It will probably vibrate some years between the two and then terminate between one and the other. Elbridge Gerry also says he won't support the Constitution. And he won't support it. A, there's no Bill of Rights. B, he says there's a civil war brewing in Massachusetts. Remember, the year had begun with a civil war in Massachusetts. And Gerry says it's a civil war between supporters of democracy, which Gerry says is the worst of all political evils, and their opponents, who are just as violent in the opposite extreme. These two factions, Gerry predicts, are going to collide over the Constitution, which he thought should have been more conciliating. And Edmund Randolph, the guy who had introduced the Virginia plan at the very beginning, also announces he won't be supporting the Constitution either. He thinks the plan gives the Congress too much power. And, Randolph is a politician. Well, most of these guys are politicians, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. He counts votes, and he wants to know what people in Virginia are going to think about it. And if the plan turns out to be unpopular in Virginia, Randolph doesn't want people in Virginia to know he supported it. So he's really hedging his bets. And he joins Gary and Mason in calling for a second convention. Now, in the midst of this, our friend Franklin reads another of his speeches. In fact, the night before, Franklin had called all of the Pennsylvania delegates to his home on Market Street, and they thought he was calling them to tell them why he was not going to support the Constitution. Instead, he calls them together because he wants the convention to adopt the Constitution unanimously. He doesn't want people to say, hey, you know, they really disagreed about what was in it. And Franklin has this speech read the next day. Actually, James Wilson reads it, and I will share it with you. I confess there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. Most men, indeed, as well as most sects in religion, think themselves in possession of all truth, and that wherever others differ from them, it is so far error. Steele, a Protestant, in a dedication tells the Pope that the only difference between our churches is the Church of Rome is infallible and the Church of England is never in the wrong. But though many private persons think almost as highly of their own infallibility as that of their sect, few express it so naturally as a certain French lady who, in a dispute with her sister, said, I don't know how it happens, sister, but I meet with nobody but myself that's always in the right. In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. There is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered, and believe farther that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I doubt too whether any other convention we can obtain may be better able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected. It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. And I think it will astonish our enemies, who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus I consent to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. The opinions I have had of its errors I sacrifice to the public good. I've never whispered a syllable of them abroad. Within these walls they were born, here they shall die. If every one of us, in returning to our constituents, were to report the objections he has had to it and endeavor to gain partisans in support of them, we might prevent it being generally received and thereby lose all the salutary effects and great advantages resulting naturally in our favor among foreign nations as well as among ourselves from our real or apparent unanimity. Much of the strength and efficiency of any government in procuring and securing happiness to the people depends on opinion, on the general opinion of the goodness of the government, as well as of the wisdom and integrity of its governors. I hope, therefore, that for our own sakes as a part of the people, and for the sake of posterity, we shall act heartily and unanimously in recommending this Constitution, if approved by Congress and confirmed by the conventions, wherever our influence may extend, and turn our future thoughts and endeavors to the means of having it well administered. On the whole, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of this convention who may still have objections to it would, with me on this occasion, doubt a little of his own infallibility, and to make manifest our unanimity, put his name to this instrument. So Franklin calls for unanimity. 39 of the delegates representing 12 states do sign the Constitution. Gary, Randolph, and Mason refused. And as the delegates were signing, Franklin looked at the chair behind the president and noted that there was half of a sun on it. And he said that I have often and often in the course of this session, with the vicissitudes and my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. Now at length I have the happiness to know it is a rising and not a setting sun. So the convention approves the Constitution, submits it to Congress, which will then submit it to the states for ratification. And under its terms, 9 state conventions will have to approve it to take it into effect, which means that almost immediately a debate is going to begin about whether or not this Constitution should be ratified. And we'll be talking more about this over the next week or so. Next time we'll be looking at James Wilson's speech explaining why the Constitution should be ratified, and then one of the essays by Brutus. There are a lot of others, because what happens next, remember, this is a debate that's happened in secret. And suddenly the convention publishes their work. The convention had assembled to change the Articles of Confederation, and what they've done is create an entirely new system. And it is partly federal, which the American people were used to, but also partly national, which was new. And you're going to see a number of big issues come up in this debate. That is, reading through the Constitution itself, and I know you have other things to do between now and Wednesday, reading through it, you're going to find things you might find objectionable, and someone in 1787 would find objectionable. That is, Congress has power over this 10-mile square district where the federal government will meet. This will, you can imagine that might be a problematic thing. States are restricted in what they can do. Congress has the power to levy taxes, and there doesn't seem to be any limit to that power. The way the president is elected is a little cumbersome, and the president can be eligible for life, as could members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Confederation had term limits. There are restrictions on what the states can do. And the big problem that keeps coming back is there is no Bill of Rights. Most of the state constitutions began with a Declaration of Rights. And here you have a constitution that doesn't have one. In his speech, James Wilson will try to explain not only why a Bill of Rights is unnecessary, but why it would be dangerous to have one. Noah Webster, one of the proponents of ratification, goes further and says a Bill of Rights is a stupid idea. So you can see the proponents of the Constitution wanting to have it ratified, but opponents having serious questions about it. I mean, if I were going to be laying odds, who are the biggest proponents of the Bill of Rights or Articles of Amendment? Well, you're going to see this over and over again during the ratification debate. It's a difference of opinion as to what the rights should be. But we know governments are created to secure rights. And here you have a government that doesn't secure rights at all. And if you, the biggest proponents are people in the states who oppose the Constitution for a lot of different reasons. And in fact, James Madison, by the way, sends a copy of the Constitution to Thomas Jefferson, who is the American minister to to France. And Madison doesn't think there needs to be a Bill of Rights. Jefferson does. And Madison thinks a Bill of Rights wouldn't really work. He points out that the Declaration of Rights in Virginia still allowed Baptists to be taxed to support the Anglican Church. So what good is a Bill of Rights? Jefferson makes a good argument as to why a Bill of Rights actually would be an effective way to prevent that kind of thing. And then there's a disagreement of what should be the right. So Charles Coatsworth Pinckney of South Carolina, at the South Carolina Convention, when they're arguing about a Bill of Rights, he points out that bills of rights generally begin by saying all men are born free and equal. He said we'd make that assertion with a very ill grace, since most of our people are actually born slaves. So if you have a Bill of Rights, would it really mean anything? So I've given you a link to the ratification project at the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. And you can look in there. I mean, look in the index there for particular rights and how they come up in this debate, because it's the argument that's really going to consume us over the next couple of years here. First, should the Constitution be ratified? And the fact that there is no Bill of Rights is a pretty effective argument against it if you like a Bill of Rights. James Wilson tries to make an argument as to why it wouldn't be of that much use. So does Noah Webster, and we can decide whether we agree with them. So this is one thing. By the way, Madison, when he is writing to Jefferson, Madison is a good politician in that he knows how to count. And he draws up a chart for Jefferson saying how he thinks things are going to go. And like most of the people of his day, he would go geographically. So he draws the yes states: New Hampshire, yes. Massachusetts, divided. Massachusetts, no. So New Hampshire, definitely yes. Massachusetts, remember, they'd had this civil war going on. Unclear how they're going to vote. Rhode Island, definitely no. Connecticut, definitely yes. New York, most powerful political figure in New York, George Clinton, hadn't weighed in on this, probably going to oppose it. Only one delegate from New York stayed to sign it, and that was Hamilton. And so there's a big fight going to go on in New York. New Jersey, probably yes. Pennsylvania, unclear. It's going to be a fight in Pennsylvania, which we'll talk about probably next time. Maryland, unclear. Virginia, don't know. Delaware, always forget about Delaware, probably yes. North Carolina, unclear. South Carolina, yes. Georgia, yes. So you need 9 states to ratify. How many do you have? How many does Madison guarantee are going to vote to ratify? 6. Okay. Do you notice anything about the states that Madison says are definitely going to ratify, or those who are undecided? Yes, Paul.
The definite ones are the small, by and large, the smaller states, and the undecided ones are by and large the bigger states.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because remember, the small states had been most opposed during the first half of the convention. But now, for a variety of reasons, they're all supporting this. The bigger ones, of course, you're going to have a more of a difference of opinion in big states. And so you can see the bigger states, there's a big fight going on. And Massachusetts was on the verge of civil war at the beginning of the year. New York, probably against it. Pennsylvania, by the way, the supporters of the Constitution in Pennsylvania want to get this ratified as quickly as possible. So they want to call for a convention, and they have the votes in the legislature to do it. They will have the votes in the legislature if only they have a quorum. The opponents of ratification, who support the state constitution, by the way, it becomes confusing in Pennsylvania because there is a political faction called the Constitutionalists. They are supporters of the 1776 Constitution, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, very democratic constitution. Their opponents call themselves Republicans. They don't like that democratic constitution. They want a Republican constitution. And the constitutionalists in Pennsylvania tend to oppose ratifying the Constitution. They know the one way they can slow the process down is by staying away from Independence Hall, where the assembly meets. And so what the proponents do, by the way, we've seen this happen in a legislative body. You stop a quorum by having the members of the assembly leave. In this case, they're leaving because they say this government is an attempt to force us into tyranny. And what the supporters of the Constitution do is have the militia go and round these people up and bring them into the legislative hall at the point of a bayonet so that they can be there to vote for ratification, for calling a state convention, not for ratification, but just calling a convention. So if you're arguing the purpose of this Constitution is to deprive you of liberty, and then the proponents of it are rounding up elected members of the legislature and dragging them into the legislative hall, they're pretty much making your case for you. I'm just warming up on this subject, but I know you all have lives to get back to. I may just sit here talking to myself about it for the next hour or so and figuring out how it is going to go. So I'll see you on Wednesday when we'll continue discussing the debate over ratifying the Constitution, keeping in mind what Madison's arithmetic. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time. Take care.
Professor, I just have a question for you.
Yes, 1 second.